Hello and welcome back to High School History, and today's video is going to be about theme 3, Kinship, Caste and Class, and we will quickly look at some of the important questions that could be asked in the board exams. But before we go ahead, as always, please note that these are not short questions. I have only estimated them based on previous trends, so don't just limit yourselves to just the questions that I'm talking about. If you score very high marks, then you should be even more thorough in your questions. This video is specifically targeted towards those who may be doing last minute study, who have not really been able to prepare too much earlier on, and they don't have a lot of time right now to go into a thorough preparation. This is just to give them these broad outlines so that they can score better than they would otherwise. So let's start. When you look at page 54, it talks about the critical edition of the Mahabharat, and you can be asked what was the critical edition of the Mahabharat, who was the team leader, how much time it took, how many pages, and so on and so forth, which would be for 1 mark or 3 marks. And you may even be asked about similarities and differences between the Sanskrit versions of the Mahabharat from across the subcontinent. There are 2 listed here, so it could be either for 1 mark or 3 marks with a tag question. When you come to page 55 to 56, they are talking about the concept of patrilineage, or tracing your lineage through your father, or inheriting your father's property. But this was only meant for men and boys. They were never meant for women. We do have some exceptions though, but largely in this chapter we are sticking to patrilineage. You may even be asked a question as to why it was important and if there were any exceptions. And these questions could be for 1 mark or 3 marks. Then when you look at page 57 to 58, this talks about rules of marriage. What were the Brahmanical prescriptions? There were 8 forms of marriage, of which 4 were desirable and 4 undesirable. And you could be asked a question on giving examples of where Brahmanical prescriptions were not always followed. In this case, you can talk about the Satvahana Gotras, or you can talk about Draupadi's polyandrous marriage. And then were there exceptions to these rules? So again, whether you're talking about prescriptions not always being followed or exceptions, they largely mean the same thing, and they could come for 1 or 3 marks. Then pages 58 to 60, they are talking about Gotra of women. So there could be 2 rules of Gotra which have been listed in your text. So you could be asked a question on that. What were the Gotra norms and what were the exceptions? So if you're looking at one of them being that women gave up their Gotra at the time of marriage and adopted their husband's Gotra. Satvahanas were the exceptions here, so you can talk about it like this. Or for example, when you talk about patrilineage, generally the sons take their father's name, but among the Satvahanas we see that often the kings are named after their mother's Gotra as well. So again, these could be for 1 or 3 marks. Going to page 61, there are right occupations for the 4 Varnas. So according to the Purusha Sukta hymn, what are the 4 Varnas and what are their rights and what are the kind of jobs they can do? You can be asked a question on that. And there can be also a question on strategies to reinforce the Varna system. What were the strategies Brahmins were using to make sure that more and more people would follow the Varna system? So this could be for 3 marks. Then pages 62 and 63 talk about Kshatriya Kings. Were all the king Kshatriyas? Obviously the answer is no. And who were the non-Kshatriya kings? So in this case, you have examples like the Kanvas and the Shungas, who were Brahmins, Mauryas, whose caste is not really known, so most likely they were from the backward castes, right? So you can be asked questions on this concept also, that there were exceptions to these Brahmanical norms, as we have seen also in rules of marriage or Gotra rules. Then pages 63 and 64, they talk about Jothee and social mobility. So what is Jothee? They are largely within the Varna order, but they are usually linked with the people's occupations. And this also indicates social mobility, that within the Varna you can claim a slightly higher status if you are part of a certain occupation. For example, both blacksmiths and goldsmiths were Shudras, but when you saw the Jothee, goldsmiths always were able to claim a higher status than that of the blacksmiths. So you can be asked questions based on that. You could even be asked questions based on the nishadas, or those who were slightly outside of the Varna system. Here again, you can be asked questions ranging from 1 to 3 marks. Then when you look at page 66, it mainly focuses on the Chandal. Chandal is kind of outside the Varna system. They are considered as untouchables. What was their status in society? What were their duties? And some foreign travelers who talked about them. So you can get 1 markers here in terms of objective type questions, or you can get 3 mark questions as well. Coming to page 68, it talks about women's access to property. Could women own property? What kind of property could they own? For example, women could not own immovable property like houses and land. However, they could own the jewelry and the gifts that they received at the time of marriage. There is also a question on whether women themselves were pieces of property. So there is one very strong thought process where women were considered to be their husband's property, and this particular debate is handled in the Mahabharat when Draupadi is ordered into the court when Yudhishthir loses the game of dice, and she questions whether Yudhishthir lost himself before he put Draupadi on stake or after, right? So we can see that during the period of Mahabharata, this whole concept of ownership of women was also under question. So this question can also be asked for 3 or 8 marks. In an 8 marker, you will always have a tag question, as I have been reminding you in previous videos as well. When we come to page 70 to 71, here they are talking about a social alternative where wealth is even shared. So there are some examples of poorer chiefs, especially in the Deccan, where agricultural revenue was not very high and raids were considered a legitimate way of supplementing your income, and the kings and chiefs would go and raid the neighboring territories, and whatever wealth they came back with, they would distribute them among people who served these chiefs. So there was a concept of sharing of wealth also. This is usually for 3 marks, or if you get the source 14, then this would obviously be a source based questions with multiple parts. Coming to page 72, you have the social contract theory according to the Buddhist thought. Now, this is very interesting. You may get a standalone question as to what was the social contract theory, what was the story behind it. You can even get a question on how it was different from the Brahmanical explanation of the Varna system. So just a few pages earlier, there was a discussion on the Purusha Sukta hymn, where the Brahman arose from or originated from the mouth of the Adi Purusha, the Kshatriyas from the shoulders, and so on. So how were these two different? So when you talk about, where in the Buddhist philosophy they are talking about the social contract is more man-made, so it can be changed and modified according to the needs of the time, whereas the Varna order is supposed to be of divine origin, which means you cannot change it. So there are these few differences which are there in the text, so focus on this. These could be asked as 1, 3 or 8 markers. Now when I'm telling you this, let me also point out to you that don't just stick to the number of points as the marks assigned. So if it's a 3 marker, don't just write 3 points and forget about it. In the past, as I have said in the previous videos as well, the marking scheme that comes to the board examiner often says that the answer is to be marked as a whole. So for a 3 marker, the examiner might actually be looking at 5 to 6 points. So always give a few extra points in your answers to make sure that the examiner does not have any excuse to cut your marks. Then page 73, we move back to a more literary and content aspect of the Mahabharata. So you look at the language and what would the language of the Mahabharata indicate. When we study the Sanskrit of the Mahabharata, it's a much simpler form of Sanskrit than the more classical version. So scholars feel that the Mahabharata was actually composed for women and Shudras who did not have the right to study classical Sanskrit, but social norms and their place in society had to be taught to them. So how would you do that? You kind of weave it into a story, and you give examples like Eklavya, who tried to transgress his caste position and he was punished by having to cut off his thumb, or when Draupadi transgresses her boundaries. For example, she challenges the men of the court, which leads to her disrobement. Okay, so most likely the Mahabharata was therefore composed for the women and the Shudras. Often to be read out by the temple pandit in the courtyard of the temple. These concepts could also be asked as 1, 3 or 8 markers. Then pages 74 to 75 talk about authors and dates of composition, and what are some of the meeting points. So when you look at authors, it probably started with the charioteer bards, and then later on the Brahmins took over. So you could get questions on that. What are the rough dates of composition? So roughly, most scholars agree that it was only during the Gupta period that the final version of the Mahabharata was completed. And then you also have a discussion on a convergence, or how we can find evidence, or what archaeological evidence do we have for the Mahabharata. We may not have any direct archaeological evidence for the Mahabharata, but we do have a lot of cultural references. For example, the material culture may reflect people's thought processes of the times, which are also reflected in the Mahabharata, right? So you may not have found the weapons used by Arjun, for example. The great warriors, especially archers, were considered to be very, very important in society at that time, right? So these are some of the points of convergence. There is a reference to Bibi Lal's excavations. You could be asked a short question on that as well. Then when we come to the last part of the chapter, which is pages 77 to 78, how can you say that the Mahabharata is a dynamic text? So basically here you talk about how even today a text like Mahabharata is very, very relevant to us, where it still talks about inheritance, where it talks about what is right and wrong. It talks about people's opinions as well. So this is how it's dynamic, how art and both performing as well as visual arts are borrowing heavily from the themes of the Mahabharata, and how the Mahabharata continues to be told and retold from different perspectives. So in the recent years, there have been Mahabharata being retold from Draupadi's perspective, or Mahabharata being retold from Bhim's perspective. And the textbook, of course, tells you about Mahashweta Devi and her retelling of Mahabharata, where there is the story of Kunti, and this is after the war, where she's in the forest and she encounters a tribal woman whose mother-in-law and whose 5 husbands had perished in the house of lack. So it is also about how historians are relooking at the Mahabharata also in ways that subaltern histories can also come out. So those whose voices had been suppressed, even they are now finding voice through the retellings of the Mahabharata. So again, these questions can come for 3 or 8 marks. With this, we come to the end of the video. I would exhort you to like and share the video as much as possible, and help your friends study better for the board examinations. Do subscribe to the channel, because I'm putting out content very regularly right now, so that you can get notifications as soon as I have posted a fresh video. Do also join the Facebook group, and you can ask a lot of questions there, and we'll try to answer all your questions. And if you have very specific questions from this chapter, do put them down in the comments. I will try to get back to them and answer the questions as soon as I can. With this, we are going to sign out, and don't forget that Slides Mania has a lot of lovely templates for you to make your own Google Slides or PowerPoint presentations for your projects and so on in future as well. So with this, I wish you bye-bye and all the best.